The whispers of weakness filled the grand halls of the Zervari palace, slithering through the shadows like venomous serpents. King Zeldar sat motionless on his obsidian throne, his clawed fingers tightening around the armrests as he watched his daughter struggle to stand. Princess Silvara's pale lavender skin shimmered under the artificial lights, her breath ragged, her legs trembling as she fought against the light gravity of their homeworld. The court watched in silence, their expressions masked, but their thoughts clear. An heir too fragile to rule. A disappointment. A liability. Zeldar had seen enough. He rose, his imposing form casting a long shadow over the chamber. "Leave us," he commanded. The nobles hesitated, their hunger for spectacle unsatisfied, but the glare of their king left no room for defiance. They filed out, their murmurs retreating beyond the massive doors. Silvara collapsed to her knees the moment they were alone. Her fists clenched the cold marble floor, her frustration palpable. "I am trying," she whispered, her voice shaking. "I train. I study. But no matter what I do, my body fails you." Zeldar finished, his tone neither cruel nor kind. He stepped forward, his piercing gaze locked onto her. "And so I have found you a solution." She looked up, her silver eyes filled with confusion. "What do you mean?" The doors at the far end of the throne room groaned open once more. Heavy boots echoed against the polished floor, the sound alien in a palace of silence. A figure emerged, taller than any Zervari, his skin a shade of warm bronze, his stance radiating confidence. His movements were effortless, controlled, unlike the cautious grace of the nobles or the practiced discipline of the royal guards. He carried himself with a presence Silvara had never seen before. "A human," she breathed, disbelief coloring her tone. "Dorian Kane," the man introduced himself, his voice steady, his gaze unwavering. "Captain. Veteran. Your new protector and instructor." Silvara frowned, looking between him and her father. "A bodyguard? I do not need a protector." Zeldar's eyes darkened. "He is not here to shield you. He is here to fix you." Dorian crossed his arms, expression unreadable. "You're weak," he said bluntly. "I won't sugarcoat it. But that doesn't mean you have to stay weak." Silvara bristled, anger flashing across her face. "You think I haven't tried? My people are warriors, trained from birth. Yet I am." "Not them," Dorian interrupted. "And that's your advantage." She stared at him, uncertain whether to be insulted or intrigued. Zeldar turned to Dorian. "You have 6 months. If she does not improve, you will be deemed a failure. And I do not tolerate failure." Dorian met the king's gaze without hesitation. "Then it's a good thing I don't fail." Zeldar gave a slow nod before turning away. "Then take her. Train her. And do not return until she is worthy of my throne." Silvara felt the weight of the moment settle on her shoulders. She had spent her life trying to prove herself to her people, to her father, to the nobles who doubted her. Now an outsider, a human, would be the one to decide if she was worthy. She turned to Dorian, her jaw tightening. "Fine. Where do we start?" He studied her for a long moment before nodding. "We start with pain." The first blow sent Silvara sprawling across the training mat, her breath knocked from her lungs as she gasped for air. Pain flared along her ribs, her body screaming in protest as she struggled to push herself up. Dorian Kane stood over her, arms crossed, expression unreadable. "Get up," he ordered. Silvara's vision swam, her limbs shaking. This wasn't like the ceremonial combat drills she had been forced to endure under the palace instructors, where every strike was pulled, every motion calculated to avoid injury. This was real. This was brutal. She had barely seen him move before she was on the ground. "Again," he said. Anger burned in her chest, cutting through the humiliation. She pushed herself up, her hands curling into fists. Her muscles ached, but she refused to show weakness. The moment she got her footing, he moved. Fast. Too fast. She barely managed to shift before his foot swept under her legs, sending her crashing down once more. The impact jarred her bones, and this time, she couldn't stop the pained gasp that escaped her lips. Dorian sighed. "You're not listening." Silvara gritted her teeth. "I don't need to listen. I need to fight." "No. You need to survive." She glared up at him, frustration boiling over. "I am trying." "Trying isn't enough," he snapped. "Your enemies won't care that you tried. They'll cut you down before you even understand what's happening. Your body is weak, yes. But your mind? That's what will kill you first." Silvara forced herself to her knees, her breathing ragged. "Then tell me, what am I doing wrong?" Dorian crouched down to her level, his gaze sharp. "You fight like you expect to win. That's your first mistake. You don't have the strength to overpower me. You don't have the speed to outrun me. So stop trying to play by rules that aren't yours." She frowned, wiping blood from her lip. "Then what do I do?" "You adapt." Dorian stood, offering her a hand. She hesitated before gripping it, letting him pull her up. The moment she was steady, he struck. A feint, subtle but deliberate. This time, she didn't react the way she had before. Instead of meeting force with force, she shifted her weight, stepping back just enough to avoid the trap. His eyes flickered with approval. "Good. Now do it again." For hours, he drilled her, knocking her down, pulling her up, forcing her to relearn every instinct she had ever been taught. The palace trainers had conditioned her to stand tall, to move with precision and control. But Dorian stripped all of that away. He taught her to move differently, to be unpredictable, to be fluid. He showed her how to make her size an advantage, how to use her opponent's momentum against them, how to see patterns in movement before they formed. Her body protested every step of the way. The weakness was still there, the limits of her own biology undeniable. But something else began to take root. A new kind of strength. By the time she collapsed for the final time, sweat drenching her skin, the pain no longer felt like failure. It felt like progress. Dorian knelt beside her, watching as she caught her breath. "You're learning," he admitted. Silvara exhaled, a shaky breath, a flicker of defiance in her exhausted eyes. "I don't plan to stop." He smirked. "Good. Because tomorrow it gets worse." The arena was silent, the weight of expectation pressing down on Silvara like a vice. She stood in the center, heart pounding against her ribs, her fingers twitching at her sides. Across from her, Verixul, a towering warrior with years of battle experience, cracked his knuckles and sneered. The court had gathered in the high balconies, their expressions a mix of amusement and morbid anticipation. This was not a fair fight. It was a display, a lesson, a punishment. She was the fragile princess, the unworthy heir. He was the noble champion, handpicked by those who wanted to see her fail. Dorian stood at the edge of the arena, arms crossed. He had said nothing when the challenge was issued, only watching with that sharp, assessing gaze. Now, as she met his eyes, he gave the smallest nod. She exhaled slowly. The gong rang. Varric moved first, a blur of motion as he lunged. Fast. Heavy. A killing strike. Silvara dodged barely. The air screamed as his fist passed inches from her skull. She twisted, stepping out of reach, her instincts screaming at her to run. But running meant weakness, and weakness meant death. The second strike came faster, an overhead hammering blow. This time, she didn't move back, she moved in. The moment his arm came down, she sidestepped, letting the force of his own momentum pull him forward. His balance faltered for a fraction of a second. Not enough for anyone else to notice. But she did. Dorian's lessons came back in a rush. Don't fight their strength. Use it. Silvara pivoted, her foot sweeping behind his knee. It wasn't a powerful strike, it didn't need to be. His own force did the work for her. His leg buckled, his weight shifting. She struck. A sharp elbow to the ribs. As small Insignificant blow. But in that moment, it sent a shock through the gathered nobles. The princess had landed a hit. Varric snarled, regaining his footing. His pride burned hotter than any wound. He swung again, this time wilder, more aggressive. She ducked, moved, slipped through the gaps. She didn't need to overpower him, only outlast him. The match stretched on, seconds feeling like hours. The court had expected a quick, humiliating defeat. Instead, they watched something else unfold. Silvara was still standing. Varric's movements grew sloppier, frustration leaking into his attacks. And then an opening, the smallest hesitation in his stance. She didn't think. She acted. Her body moved on instinct, a step forward, a twist, a strike aimed for the point where armor didn't protect. She struck his side, her fingers pressing into the nerve cluster just beneath the ribs. Varric froze. His entire frame locked for a split second. Just enough. Silvara surged forward, throwing all of her weight into a final, desperate move. She drove her knee into his sternum. He stumbled, feet skidding across the dirt. And then he fell. Silence. The court watched, stunned, as Varric Zul, the seasoned warrior, lay on the ground, gasping for air, while the fragile princess stood above him. Dorian smirked. Silvara turned, breathing hard, meeting the gaze of her father. King Zeldar leaned forward on his throne, expression unreadable. The nobles whispered, their shock palpable. She had not won, not truly, but she had not lost. And that more than anything terrified them. The blood on Silvara's knuckles had dried, leaving behind darkened smudges against her lavender skin. The whispers in the palace corridors had changed. Where once they murmured of weakness, now they spoke in hushed, uncertain tones. A princess who could fight. A fragile heir who had endured. A daughter of the king who refused to break. She should have felt triumph. Instead, she felt the weight of unseen eyes. Dorian had warned her. Strength wasn't just about surviving a fight. It was about what came after. The moment she had stood over Varric Zul's fallen form, the balance of power had shifted. No one had expected her to walk away from that duel unbroken. Now, they feared what she might become. And fear was dangerous. You're being watched, Dorian muttered as they walked through the palace gardens, his tone casual, but his eyes scanning the towering walls and high balconies above. I know, Silvar replied. Good. Then you also know it won't stop. She exhaled, frustration curling in her chest. I proved myself. Why is that not enough? Dorian stopped, turning to face her fully. Because proof isn't what they wanted. They wanted failure. They wanted a reason to dismiss you, to strip you of your place before you ever became a real threat. You didn't just survive that fight, you shattered their expectations. And now, they don't know what to do with you. Silvara's jaw tightened. She had trained for this moment, endured pain she never thought she could withstand. Yet the battle had only just begun. A rustling sound broke through her thoughts. Too faint. Too controlled. Dorian moved before she could react, his hand gripping her wrist as he pulled her sharply to the side. The whisper of a blade cutting air passed through the space she had just occupied. The assassin landed silently, dark robes blending into the night, curved daggers gleaming under the moonlight. No words, no hesitation, just a killer's cold efficiency. Silvara's body moved before her mind could catch up. A step back. A shift in weight. She raised her arms just as Dorian lunged forward, intercepting the next strike. Steel clashed against his bracers, a sharp, metallic ring slicing through the air. Stay close, Dorian ordered. The assassin pivoted, fluid and precise, slipping between the shadows. Fast, too fast. But Silvara saw it now. The openings. The movements. The patterns. She had spent her life being told she was weak. She had spent the last few months learning how to change that. When the assassin struck again, she was ready. She ducked, letting the blade pass harmlessly over her shoulder, her hands moving on instinct. A twist. A sharp step inward. The assassin had been expecting fear. He found something else instead. She drove her elbow into his ribs. A small, sharp impact. Not enough to incapacitate, but enough to disrupt. Dorian didn't hesitate. His fist collided with the assassin's jaw, sending him staggering. Before the attacker could recover, Dorian twisted behind him, his arm locking around the assassin's throat. A second later, the body slumped to the ground, unconscious. Silvara stared at the fallen form, her heart still racing. Dorian exhaled, nudging the assassin with his foot. "Well, that answers that." "That answers what?" she asked, her pulse still hammering in her ears. "They're not just watching anymore," Dorian said grimly. "They're testing. And next time, they won't send just one." Silvara looked down at her bruised hands, at the assassin lying motionless at her feet. The court had feared what she might become. Now, they were trying to stop her before she got there. The throne room was filled with silence, thick and suffocating. Silvara stood at the foot of the grand steps leading to her father's seat, her breath steady, her expression unreadable. The nobles lined the chamber, their gazes sharp with barely concealed hostility. None of them had expected her to survive this long. King Zeldar watched her, with the same unreadable expression he always wore. His fingers tapped against the armrest of his obsidian throne, slow, methodical. His golden eyes studied her, weighing something unseen. "The attempt on your life," he finally said, voice even. "You handled it well." Silvara inclined her head slightly. "It was not the first. It will not be the last." Murmurs rippled through the court. There had been whispers of her survival, of course, but no confirmation. Now, with those few words, she had exposed the rot within the palace. Someone had sent that assassin. Someone in this very room. Zeldar leaned forward slightly. "You believe someone here wishes to see you dead?" Silvara met his gaze without flinching. "I do not believe, father." "I know." A tense silence. A test. Zeldar exhaled, sitting back. "Then you have learned the most important lesson of ruling." He gestured, and from the shadows, guards stepped forward, dragging a bound figure into the open. The assassin, bruised, silent, his face set in rigid defiance. "You did not kill him," Zeldar mused. Dorian, standing at her side, was the one who answered. "A corpse gives no answers." The king's lips twitched slightly. Amusement? Approval? It was impossible to tell. One of the nobles stepped forward. Lord Varkan, a powerful figure in the empire's hierarchy, his robes adorned with ceremonial gold trim. "With all due respect, your majesty, the princess's survival is troubling." His words were careful, measured, but the meaning behind them was clear. If she is strong, then she must be tested. That is the way of the Zervari. If she is weak, then this is merely delaying the inevitable. Silvara felt the weight of the court's attention pressing down on her. She had been an afterthought before, a fragile, dying heir who would never sit upon the throne. But now she was a problem. She could see it in their eyes. They were afraid, and fear made people dangerous. She turned her head slightly, meeting Dorian's gaze. A silent question passed between them. He gave the smallest nod. Silvara stepped forward. "If a test is what you want," she said, voice steady, "then I will give you one." The murmurs grew louder. Zeldar's expression remained unreadable. Elaborate, she let her gaze sweep across the gathered nobles, her posture unwavering. "There is a system on the outskirts of the Dominion, ravaged by war, ruled by pirates and warlords. A stain upon our empire." She let the words sink in. "I will take it. I will cleanse it. I will bring it under our control." A challenge. One they could not refuse without revealing their own cowardice. Varkan sneered. "A bold claim. With what army?" Silvara smiled. It was not a kind expression. Give me command of the 7th Fleet. I will return with victory, or I will not return at all." The challenge hung in the air. King Zeldar studied her for a long, waited moment. Then, slowly, he smiled. "Then let the galaxy see what my daughter is truly capable of." The bridge of the Vindicator pulsed, with quiet tension. The massive warship, the spearhead of the 7th Fleet, cut through the void, its sleek hull reflecting the distant light of a dying star. Outside, beyond the thick viewport, the shattered remains of the Valix system drifted like carcasses in the dark. Once a proud colony of the Zervari Dominion, now overrun by warlords and scavengers who thought themselves untouchable. Silvara stood at the helm, her posture straight, her expression cold. Every pair of eyes on the bridge was on her, some filled with skepticism, others with cautious respect. She was still the unproven princess to many of them, a fragile heir who had no place leading warriors into battle. They were about to learn the truth. Dorian stepped beside her, arms crossed, eyes scanning the enemy fleet gathered in the debris field ahead. Dozens of ships, mercenary bands, pirate war frigates, stolen Dominion vessels. A force that had grown fat on the belief that no one would dare challenge them. "They're waiting for a show of strength," Dorian murmured. "They don't think you'll fire first." Silvara exhaled slowly. "Then they don't know me at all." She turned to the weapons officer, a hardened veteran, with scars tracing the ridges of his face. "Target their flagship. Full spread. No warning shot." The officer hesitated just a fraction. No negotiation? No diplomacy? She felt the doubt in the room. This was the moment. The moment they decided whether she was a leader or a liability. Silvara's voice was sharp as steel. "Do you need me to repeat myself?" The hesitation vanished. "No, Commander." A second later, the ship shuddered as the first volley of plasma torpedoes launched from the Vindicator's cannons, streaking across the void like vengeful stars. The enemy fleet had barely begun to react when the first explosion ripped through their flagship, tearing through its hull in a blinding chain reaction. The pirate fleet fractured. Some surged forward, scrambling to retaliate. Others broke formation in sheer panic. That was all she needed. "Advance the fleet," she ordered. "Pin them against the asteroid field. Do not let a single one escape." The officers moved with newfound precision. She saw it in their eyes. Respect, not just obedience. She had given them what they needed. A leader who did not hesitate. A leader who struck first. Dorian grinned beside her. "They're learning." The battle unfolded in chaos, but Silvara saw patterns in it, like Dorian had taught her. She gave no ground, no mercy. The enemy, so used to preying on the weak, now found themselves hunted. One by one, their ships fell. Some tried to flee. She denied them. By the time the last warlord's vessel was disabled, the 7th Fleet stood victorious, unscathed. The Valix system was hers. Silvara turned to the bridge, letting her voice carry. "Send word to the palace," she said. "The princess is conquered." The officers pounded their fists to their chests in salute. Dorian leaned in, his voice low. "And now they fear you even more." Silvara's gaze was distant, locked on the wreckage outside. The old version of her, the fragile girl who had been doubted, dismissed, was gone. Let them fear. She was no longer the princess they pitied. She was the heir they could not stop.